is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Call the Cabinet. Ask your question now. Call 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
Morning, 3 minutes after 9 on Tuesday, November the 24th. Call the Cabinet with Transport Secretary, Cabinet Minister, of course, Grant Shapps, who's in the studio with me now. It's a bit of a surreal moment, actually, and I should say we are suitably socially distanced, but all the monitors has pictures of you. It's like something out of some strange movie, as everywhere I look, I'm seeing various images of Grant Shapps, but obviously they're running what you've been saying, Mr. Shapps, particularly as regards test and release or the changes in quarantine. Briefly, just run over what you've been saying on that ground, and welcome to the programme. Thanks for taking
Thank you, Nick. Great to be here. Well, first of all, as you know, if you happen to come back from an area which is not in the travel corridor, then you must quarantine. It's 14 days, actually 15, because you don't release till the end of the last day. That means that for a lot of people, travel's not been a possibility. And of course, the travel corridors change around each week as the Joint Biosecurity Centre look at the data and they work out which countries we should and shouldn't be visiting. So that 14 days quarantine creates a big problem. What we've now managed to do is, through private testing capacity and at the cost of the traveller, say that if you can take a test as early as 5 days after returning, and if it is negative, you may be released from quarantine. And it is, I think, the first of a whole series of steps which will start to get our great airline industry back in the air, enable people to start travelling for business and seeing family and the rest of it.
Allowing that the cost is between £65 and £120, there is a suggestion, of course, this is only to enable the rich.
Well, first of all, I'd say, particularly in these times, travel for a lot of people is quite a discretionary activity. And what we haven't wanted to do is take away that precious testing capacity from the doctors and the nurses and the teachers, all of whom we need to be at work, and people being able to go to work as well, literally. So, yes, we have wanted to keep it apart from that. I do also think you're right. The private sector have indicated costs of between 65 and 120. I think what we'll see as this comes in is those costs being driven down as more enter the market, and some of these new types of tests called lateral flow, those are the ones that give you the answers within 30 minutes, as they start to meet the very exacting standards that we've required for these tests. I think we'll see the price probably drop quite quickly.
To what sort of level do you imagine?
Well, I don't know is the answer, but I do know that with lateral flow tests, people talk about eventually getting to tests which are, a few pounds. Right. Whether that will happen quickly enough, I don't know, because I think coming down the line after this new system, we've got the mass testing, which gives us the potential to say to people, no quarantine at all when you travel. You could come back, take a test every day for 7 days and be released. Now, that's not what we're announcing today, to be clear, just to avoid confusion. And then, of course, the third big stage, vaccines and going back to life as normal and people being able to travel as normal. So I think this is the first stage off the ground, 1,000-foot altitude, but we've got a lot further to go.
I know you're a pilot yourself, so nice analogy. Right, well, let's stay with that as your first question. That's Louise in Birmingham, and you're through to Grant Shapps. Louise, good morning. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Shapps. I'm just saying thank you for eventually getting to this point for the airline industry, but it's such a shame it's taken so long. In the interim period, the airline industry has been devastated, and so have a lot of people's lives, because I'm sure you're aware a lot of jobs have been lost. And I just think that maybe if we could have done something about the testing sooner, a lot of jobs would have been saved. And not only that, you have had a lot of CEOs who have been asking about doing this for several months now. O'Leary has from Ryanair, Willie Walsh when he was at British Airways, and Sean Doyle has recently, but his time has been great because obviously he hasn't been there very long. He's only been there since October, and now this has happened, so he's had a little bit more of a result.
Okay, let's put that to... It could have happened quicker is how I'm going to sum up, Louise, if that's all right. Stay on the line.
Louise, look, it's a really good question. The first thing to say is we started off with a total test capacity in this country of 2,000 tests a day. We built that to over 500,000, and it's growing very, very quickly. But as I was just saying to Nick, we couldn't take test capacity away from doctors and nurses and teachers and people who need to go about their domestic lives here. So that was one of the issues. The second issue is we didn't have, if you like, the the knowledge and the evidence to know that a day 5 test would be safe for test to release. And that's something which we've had to build up over time based on what the Chief Medical Officer has been able to tell us. And I can tell you it's been pretty complicated to prove the science behind it to know that that is the case. And the third thing I'd say is I hear CEOs, Mr. O'Leary and others saying, oh, you should just have had a test. So you arrive in the country, have a test and be released. Unfortunately, the medical science just does not back his argument. It's just wrong. What we know from all of the science is that would have only picked up perhaps 7% of those who are asymptomatic. Now, other countries tried this, and a lot of the airline bosses were pointing me to other countries. Look what they're doing in France. Look what they're doing in Germany. I've spoken to my opposite numbers in those countries, and actually what they will say is, yeah, actually, it didn't work. Having a day 0 as you land at Charles de Gaulle, come back into France, land at Charles de Gaulle and having a test did not detect cases. One of the reasons why, in France, for example, they've seen such a big second wave, worse than in the UK. So we have had to take a very cautious approach. Against all of that, I imagine you might be somebody in the aviation sector. Just seeing jobs lost. I came into this job actually as Transport Secretary because I love aviation, as Nick mentioned. Yep. And I do not want to see this industry suffering. It's just taken time for the technology, for the science, for the availability of tests to be there before we could get this introduced. But there's other good news as well if you are in the aviation sector. It's not been much covered. We're also providing rates relief to all the English airports today as well, which will mean that they get a break of up to £8 million on their rates today as well, which will give them a hand.
Louise, good luck. Thank you for that question. On that subject that you've just introduced, earlier in the show I spoke with John Holland Kay, you won't know, remind him, but our listeners remind, of course, Chief Executive of Heathrow Airport, and he asked me to pass this on to you, Mr. Shapps.
First of all, I want to congratulate him for the work he's done in government. But next, I want to know, why has Heathrow been discriminated against? He's allowed all small airports to get relief from business rates, but not a big airport like Heathrow. That makes no sense at all. We have all been devastated by COVID. We're down to less than 10% of our normal passenger numbers, and yet we're being expected to pay 96% of our business rates. That makes no sense when small airports are paying nothing. I think that's something that he needs to fix.
It's a really interesting comment, and I don't want to embarrass John Holland Kay by saying this, but he called me a couple of weeks ago and literally said, please help. I'm saying this on behalf of the smaller airports. Please provide some assistance in exactly this way on business rates. I'm saying this for them, not for us. And that is exactly, in fact, what we were already looking at doing and come forward with. So 21 out of 24 English international airports will qualify for the full £8 million. They will get all of their business rates paid. Heathrow is a large airport, and along with a couple of others, the £8 million doesn't come close to covering their full business rates. But I would just say it is exactly what he called and asked me for.
Shall we move on to the next question? Thank you for that, Mr. Shapps. It's to Patrick in Beverley in East Yorkshire. Patrick, you're through to the Transport Secretary. Go ahead. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Mr. Shapps, the most public sector workers are set to be offered no pay rise by your government, and your MPs are looking at collecting a 4%, £3,500 pay rise soon. I work on the railways, and here that's seeing workers in the public sector, amongst private sector and other workers, get out there, put their health on the line potentially, and keep the country running during the pandemic. Don't you think it's a bit of a disgrace that they're going to receive no pay rise from your government, and your MPs, like yourself, are going to receive up to 4.1%?
And this comes ahead of what we believe to be your colleague Rishi Sunak, and I know you wouldn't wish to preempt Mr. Sunak's work, but there is a possibility that public sector work needs to be, public sector pay needs to be frozen. Your answer to that, and also I need to ask you, will you be taking your pay rise, Mr. Shapps?
Okay, first of all, we don't know what will happen with public sector
pay
rises.
Pay should be frozen?
Well, let's leave that to the Chancellor, Rishi. But what I would say in reply to Patrick is thank you for the phenomenal work that transport workers have done throughout this pandemic, keeping our hospital workers, our care workers, food, everything else moving around the country has been terrific. I do not support MPs getting a pay rise if indeed it turns out that others do not. We'll have to wait to see if that's the case. I will personally give any pay rise I get to charity. It's an independent body.
Does Patrick deserve a pay rise?
Well, look, I think Patrick's probably done a phenomenal job from what he's what he said. I don't know exactly what he does on the railways, but I do know that we've supported Patrick and the railways with £10 billion of taxpayers' money during this crisis, because obviously the number of passengers have dropped to.
So he doesn't deserve to have his
little.
pay frozen, does he?
Well, I'll have to leave. Excuse me, I'll have to leave the pay discussions to the Chancellor. And in fact, probably if Patrick works for the railways, he may well be working for a train operating company, and it will be down to them. But what I will say is this: MPs' salaries are not decided by MPs. I don't support MPs getting pay rises if the rest of the public sector aren't, and I know that 900,000 NHS workers have had above inflation pay rises this year, but that's all history. I don't support MPs getting something that they don't, and if we do get a rise, I will be handing mine to charity.
All right. I think Patrick, thank you. Good luck for the work you do, and thank you. I think we're staying with rails with the next question. It's Charlotte in the Forest of Dean. You're through to Secretary of State. Go ahead, Charlotte. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm just saying that the HS2 project is very controversial in terms of the environment. The government recently has been trumpeting its environmental credentials, but according to the Woodland Trust, they estimate that 108 ancient woodlands are going to be destroyed by HS2, and we've seen examples of this recently. And so, is this not just virtue signalling? Because actually, you're destroying an awful lot of established ancient woodlands with ecosystems.
What about the green credentials of HS2?
Yeah,
Secretary of State?
Look, one of the best ways to travel when it comes to the environment is, of course, rail. It's
not
it's
if you
very
knock down ancient woodland.
Well, was it just on the actual transport
Right,
itself? And I'll
okay.
come back to the ancient woodlands and say,
Right.
but in terms of comparisons to other forms of transport, cars, particularly petrol and diesel cars at the moment, it's a very good way to travel. So you can imagine it will take a lot of cars, HGVs, off the road and reduce congestion, all those are the things which will be good. Of course, it is true to say that in planning this, it has cut through swathes of the countryside where it hasn't gone in tunnels, and that does mean that we have lost some ancient woodlands, against which we will have a net increase of 7 million trees through just the first phase of this project, which is from London to Birmingham. So we will have a sort of a very nice sort of green corridor boost through the project. I know it's controversial. I don't want to rerun all the HS2 debate, because it's been discussed to the nth degree. It is happening. It's already being built. But the environmental effort going into this project outclasses anything that Britain, or probably anywhere in the world, has ever built. In fact, one of the reasons it's so incredibly expensive is because it's got so much environmental consideration in the building plans.
And you say it's being built, but I note that I think it was on the weekend, the eastern leg of HS2 could be delayed by up to 20 years.
Well, I don't believe everything I read in the newspapers, and I advise you not to as well.
So there is no delay. When will the north of England and the Midlands, the East Midlands, get their bit?
Yeah, so just to remind listeners, we went ahead with HS2 after something called the Oakervee Review, and the Prime Minister and I looked...
Doug Oakervee, wasn't it? Yeah.
That's right. We made that decision to go ahead, and as the Prime Minister said at the time, the question is not to be or not to be. Now it will be. Now that is in reference to the eastern leg, which runs from broadly Birmingham up to Leeds. So we've always said that we're going ahead, but we set up an integrated rail programme to look at how we best deliver it, because when HS2 was first invented, we hadn't been talking about high-speed rail in the north, Northern Powerhouse. We weren't talking about what happens in the Midlands Connect and the hub and all the rest of it. So we just want to integrate the whole thing together. We will be going ahead. We're looking at the best way to deliver it.
So when will we punch out from Birmingham through Chesterfield and Sheffield to Leeds?
I don't have that answer for you now.
Will it be 2040, as was suggested?
Yeah, I would have thought so. I don't have that answer right now, but I won't have to keep
until
you...
2040.
Well, the original program hasn't changed yet, but when it comes to releasing the results of what's called the Integrated Rail Plan, we'll be able to tell you exactly what the projected dates are. So
it could be 2040.
I don't have dates for you right now. The point about the Integrated Rail Plan was to see whether we could deliver some bits quicker. And you could see, for example, the West and East Midlands being connected much faster. You might choose to get Sheffield connected up, to do work in Leeds, and get the whole thing done faster. So we're not at the end of the Integrated Rail Review, so I will be misleading you if I start to sort of spew out dates which are based on nothing. But I wouldn't believe it just because you read it in the newspaper. That's all I'd say.
Charlotte, thank you for that. As we're talking deadlines, that brings Julia and Barnes into the conversation for your question to the Secretary of State. Julia, go ahead. Barnes is a
Yes,
clue.
good morning, Mr. Shapps.
Morning.
Yes, there are tens of thousands of us living, including me and my family, living in absolute misery at Hammersmith Bridge at the moment. When are we going to get a concrete timetable for repairs? And when are we going to get the news that the funding that you did promise last December has been finally agreed and will be delivered?
Thanks, Julia. Well, first of all, just so listeners, you'll be aware of this, living in Barnes, but others won't. That bridge belongs to the London Borough of Hammersmith. It's entirely their responsibility. The secondary responsibility lies with TfL, Transport for London. And as you rightly point out, I've become very fed up and disappointed with the lack of action, as I can hear you have as well. So I've come along and said, I'm going to set up a task force. I'm going to knock heads together. I can't promise to pay for the whole thing because it is actually both a London issue and specifically a Hammersmith and Fulham issue, but I am going to do what I can, and indeed I've put my hand in my pocket and I've started to do that. So for example, we have now forced TfL to commission, through money that I've given them, a ferry service so we can get passengers on foot and bikes backwards and forwards. Also work to be done on getting to the bottom of the exact problem. So there are pedestals at each corner of Hammersmith Bridge. This is a Victorian structure, and those pedestals need to be uncovered for the exact problems to be located. Again, I've paid for that work to be done. This week, I'll be sitting down with the leader of Hammersmith and Fulham Council, pointing out that this is actually his legal responsibility and asking them to pitch in for this work. I won't stop until I've kept banging heads together to get the job done, but it should be being led by the Mayor and Hammersmith and Fulham Council. I'm disappointed at the lack of leadership, and that is why I've stepped in.
How helpful are they during your conversations over at Hammersmith?
Well, everyone wants it done. No one wants to pay for it, Nick. And, you can't have it both ways. It's their structure and their infrastructure for which they are the custodians of, and it's a lack of maintenance over very many years by the owner of the bridge, Hammersmith and Fulham, which has led to it being closed. So, I mean, that is clearly where the responsibility is. But I don't really want to sort of, kick responsibility around. I want to see the problem solved.
Yes.
So
it's going to take longer to fix it than it took the Victorians to build it.
Yes.
I mean, explain that if you would.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, part of that is I imagine they didn't have to concern themselves with environmental surveys and perhaps some of the modern road traffic standards that are in place today. But yeah, I mean, crazy timescales being quoted of 7 years.
You want to try and beat that down?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've already got it down, but it needs to come down a lot more. And I want to hear.
What do you want to get it down to? A year and a half, 2?
I mean, it'd be fantastic to get the thing reopened as quickly as possible. But I'm not a structural engineer, and I don't want to preempt what they find when they open up those pedestals.
Julia, just a quick word. The Secretary of State saying there's a ferry service. How has that gone down with the locals? Julia?
We'd just like a bit more information on that. It was promised that we'd have a ferry service would open in October. It's now been, then they said early next year. Now they're saying we're hearing news of September next year. Everything is far too slow, and people are really living in misery here.
I do agree. I'm totally on your side, Julia, and I'm pleased
When is the ferry service going to be viable?
I asked through the most recent settlement with TfL and the London Mayor that money specifically had to go in that settlement. It was one of my requirements to commissioning that service. They've put out for tender for that service, which is what's happening at the moment, with the purpose of it starting in the new year, and I will keep on their tails to do it. I don't get to commission this directly. It's not national government's infrastructure as it would be elsewhere in the country. So all I can do is knock heads together, try and grease the wheels a bit with some money, which I've done for this ferry service. And
but
try
it's
and
still not operating, the ferry service?
No, it won't be in place, and I think until the new year.
Okay, all right. What will happen for the Oxford-Cambridge boat race?
Well, at the moment, there are sort of discussions about whether I think boats can go underneath it or not. Hopefully it will be in a structurally safe enough position that it can take.
Because at the moment you wouldn't be able to do the boat race.
Yes, I'm not sure actually if that's I'll have to get you the very latest information, because I'm not sure actually whether they've now got sufficient confidence to allow boats to run under it, or if that will be very soon.
Well, they think the bridge could actually fall down on the oarsmen.
Obviously,
and women.
I'm not a structural engineer, but I do take I will take their advisement on this, because I do not want to see a bridge collapse. We saw that in Italy and elsewhere, and when it happens, everyone asks why.
Indeed. Questions coming in on the text, tweets and emails. Alan in Kensington, can you ask Grant Shapps, when will I be able to travel to and from the United States? Where do we stand with that?
The only barrier to your caller being able to travel to the States is that the US administration, Trump, banned the UK, Europe and other places, citizens from being able to travel there if they'd been in the UK or in Europe for the 14 days beforehand. So the entire problem is currently with the US administration. I'm working with them to try to release that ban, ideally before the inauguration of the next president, but I suspect that might be...
But people coming back from the US have to quarantine here, don't they?
Yes, they're not in a travel corridor because, of course, in the US, they've had over 250,000 deaths. The last month's been the biggest number of cases ever. They've had over 100,000 cases per day for the last 20 days, I think. It unfortunately isn't in control. However, you can fly back from the US. You must quarantine for 14 days, or... Now, as of the
middle of next month, 5. So that will apply to the US
yes,
once you can get in, or indeed anywhere else in the world. Once you can get in legally, coming back is the 5 days.
That's right. There are a few exceptions where people can get visas for the US, and of course US citizens or joint passport holders. But just to be clear,
joint passport holders can get them.
I believe so. If you have an American passport, you can. But the restriction is not something on our side. It's the Trump administration, very early on, by the way, banned international travel into the US, saying it would protect the US from infection. A lot of people made the same point to me. Why don't we ban international travel? We've seen why we didn't. It doesn't work.
Okay. A couple of others. Rachel in Bexley. Will we use the RAF to fly the Pfizer vaccine from Belgium or elsewhere in Europe into the UK?
If we need to, but I don't think that's a necessity. And we'll do whatever it takes. But I think probably the good news is with the news yesterday of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and of course this all assumes that the 3 vaccines so far get approved by the MHRA, that's the regulator, but if they do, the most readily on hand happens also to be the easiest to deal with and possibly therefore the best vaccine, which is the Oxford AstraZeneca, and we have 100 million doses that someone in government, it was actually the Health Secretary Matt Hancock, had the good sense to buy in advance. I have to tell you, more than he was advised to buy at 100 million doses of it.
Well, how many was he advised to buy?
He was advised to buy 30 million. He decided to buy 100 million. He also backed the research for 22 million in early doors.
Who does he fancy for the boat race, Oxford or Cambridge?
I don't know. Oxford may have the lead
we
right
should put
this
money
minute.
on that, shouldn't
right
we?
this
He's
minute.
obviously had a winning streak. I don't know how... appreciating that you're a constituency MP for one of the home counties, I don't know how you're well aware you are of what are called low-traffic neighbourhood areas that have been put in London, and cycle lanes. Mark in Lee Green, which is near Lewisham in South East London, who in their right mind has closed all these roads in London, who has put in these LTNs as their low-traffic neighbourhoods. You're going across London at the pace of a bicycle. Secretary of State?
Well, the answer, Lee, is the Mayor. And
Are you
he's
critical
in
of
control.
some of these?
I am. Some of these have been done very badly. Just to backtrack, though, during the main part of the first outbreak of coronavirus, we introduced active travel funding, which we thought was a very sensible idea. I still do. You can do a lot of good things by enabling people to actively travel, by which I mean walking and cycling. It's good for all of us.
Yeah.
It keeps the weight off, and as we know, with things like coronavirus, it's important as well. Some places it was used brilliantly. In other places, I'm afraid, very poorly used, and I was not impressed with some of these schemes in London. I don't know the particular one that's being referred to. I have to say I wasn't particularly impressed with the scheme that appeared in my own constituency, where they took a perfectly a lovely village actually, and blocked off access to the roads, so pedestrians couldn't cross the road, blocked off parking spaces with ugly yellow bollards.
Where is this? In Hertfordshire?
Welling.
In Welling itself, right.
And it was totally pointless. It's been removed. It's been taken out. And so with further tranches of this money, we've gone through in great detail 900 pages of applications to make sure the schemes make sense, that they're going to help. Everyone wants good cycle paths, be able to get from A to B, be able to know that you're not going to be knocked off your bike or you're able to walk safely somewhere.
There's anecdotal evidence, Transport Secretary, that emergency services are finding it very difficult to get along roads such as the Euston Road in London or Regent Street, where it's down to one carriageway each way and you can't get police or fire trucks.
This is where I'm particularly critical, because it is the case, and the Mayor should know this, that you have to consult with the emergency services before coming to these decisions. I think it's very important that local authorities, in this case TfL and Sadiq Khan, do that. Otherwise, they will just massively inconvenience people. As I say, overall, it can be a fantastically liberating, good for us all plan, but done badly, it can be very bad. We do see that the evidence shows that a lot of people think that they would like to see reduced traffic in their neighbourhood, and people welcome the better quality of air, for example, as well. So done well, it can be good.
Let's go back to the questions. Chris is in Aylesbury. You're through to the Secretary of State. Chris, go ahead. Good morning. Your question, sir.
Good morning, Nick. Thanks very much for taking my call. Right, I've got a question for the Mr. Shapps. I've been a car recovery driver for many years, and I know how dangerous smart motorways are. I understand you were going to have an inquiry. What's the latest?
Yes, yeah, I did. I carried out what I called a stock take of it. I shared your concerns. It's come out with 18 separate recommendations, which include, for example, things like these, as you all know, these recovery areas, the emergency areas, had gone from being, in the first experiment on the M42 very close together, to being miles apart. And so one of the recommendations, for example, is they must be built no more than 3/4 of a mile at the maximum a mile, and then retrospectively fitted to these motorways that are already being converted.
We've flashed about this before, possible. Secretary of State, as you're... Are you absolutely certain? Because I've got data here that says that some of these new motorways, there's 138 miles coming to a range of motorways, the M3, the M6 and various others, 1.39 miles stretches.
So where they're more than a mile, I've ordered that they have to go back and they have to consider what measures can be put in place, including installing new rescue areas. But that's not the only thing. As I say, there are 18 measures. Radar detection, because we had the crazy situation where a car would get stuck in the middle lane or something, and it would be far too slow to close that lane off and get a rescue vehicle to them and protect you as well as a rescue worker. So we need radar, things like CCTV and other technologies put into place. It's required that. Gantry systems to actually close off the lanes. Legally enforceable closed off lanes, because actually you've been, up until this last year, operating in a system where it has a crossover the lane, but all somebody was getting was a warning letter. Well, I want people to be, properly fined if they drive in those lanes, and that helps with safety, and many, many other measures as well, including about £700 million. So it's quite a quick word
from you. You're brave enough to do that job. A quick one-sentence response, if you would, Chris.
Can I give Mr. Shapps a bit of advice? Why doesn't he go out with a recovery driver for the day and see how dangerous it is?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, actually, there's something else that I'm looking at doing for you as well. Yeah, I'd love to. There's something else. In fact, I've done it. I have been on a recovery truck before, but I'll happily accept another invitation. But there's something else I'm going to do as well. You'll know that you're unable to use red lights on your vehicle. I'd like to see if that's possible to bring in, and I'm also...
Sorry, red lights?
Red lights.
You mean
so
flashing lights when he's trying to...
Yeah, your caller will know
he can only do the white ones, is it?
Yeah, or orange lights. And there's been a big call from the recovery industry to say, why can't we, if we're actually in that location, why can't we show red lights? And one of the upshots of the review that you asked about on the smart motorways was a promise to undertake a review. I have to say, that work itself was...
What's the problem with red light? Why is there resistance?
Actually, your caller may be able to explain why it's wanted and what the resistance...
Very briefly, Chris, because I've only got the Secretary for another couple of minutes. Chris, what was been? Do you understand why red lights were restricted? Chris?
Well, they could be... red lights could be mixed up with stoplights, so I gather. But
OK, so there's...
Okay.
So there's an all-party parliamentary group on the rescue services who've been calling for this. We've promised to look into it. It's only been delayed by the coronavirus thing, but that's one of the other things which is deemed to be something which is more noticeable and could help with safety, because as the caller says, people stop when they see a red light.
Soaring ambition expressed by the Prime Minister and indeed your department a couple of weeks ago, that you could effectively reverse 100 plus years of the combustion engine and in roughly 10 years bring about switch to electric and then even phase out hybrid. Realistically, are you going to be able to attain that?
Yes, and in 9 years.
Charging points.
Yeah, and in 9 years, because we're at the end of 2020 now, and we're talking about 2030. There won't be...
Where are the charging points?
They won't be entirely gone, because, of course, people will still own petrol and diesel cars, but they will be being phased out. You won't be able to buy a new one. Charging points. Here's one fact that blows people away. There are now more charging locations than petrol stations in this country. So we've already, if you like, sort of
crossed... Does that include privately owned ones as well?
No, publicly available. No, privately owned ones, hundreds of thousands more. No, I'm talking about publicly available ones.
But bear in mind, each petrol station can have like 12 pumps. But anyway, I see your point.
Correct, but the locations can also have several things. But it's not an exact comparison because it takes longer to charge an electric car. I'm a driver of an electric car.
Why am I not surprised?
Yeah, I ordered it 2 years before I became Transport Secretary, and it turned up after I became Transport Secretary, and I have to say I've driven it for a year.
Have you ever run out of charge?
Never run out of charge. It's a pleasure to drive. 2/3 of people do actually have space to charge a car at home. 1/3 of people don't, and those are the third that I'm interested in.
Yeah, they live in flats.
Right, in flats, and you've got to charge on the road. So what we need to do, to answer your question, in the next 9 years is make sure there's sufficient places for people to be able to charge at the side of the road. We're investing massively in technology. For example, I've got a trial that I funded, £40 million plus at the moment, which enables wireless charging. So you can be parked, not do anything, and charge your car. Another trial is designed to try to get to charging as you drive. So as you drive along the road, your car is charging up through things actually under the road itself, creating a charge into the car. So there's lots
like
of
a electric track.
That's it. That's how we should promote it. So a lot of this stuff is coming along. We'll make sure that everybody can charge their cars. But this idea of range anxiety that people get, I had it when I jumped into an electric car first. I've never run.
It's very common, isn't it?
It's very
Everybody
common.
does
but
it.
you feel it. But actually, I've never run out of charge. There are plenty of locations to charge at. I haven't charged at home, although I do have a home charger. I haven't charged at home for the last 2 or 3 months at all. It's perfectly practical. Even now, I think in 9 years' time, we'll make sure that it's absolutely.
Let's finish with one final question. It's going to be on restrictions. Brent in Derby, you're through to the Secretary of State with your question. Brent, morning.
Yeah, I'm restrictions about schools. I would like to know what the Minister, why he's gaslighting and his government are gaslighting schools. The winter plan, page 42 of page 44, is education. This government has no handle on what's going on in schools. He's going to go back to tiers, which clearly didn't work in the first place. We need flexibility in schools. We need the government to be honest with what's happening in schools as well. Primary and secondary pupils, the infection rate is rising. ONS figures are misleading on the education professionals coming ill with COVID as well. There is a crisis in education at the moment, and we are being ignored, and it's not fair, it's not right. I don't need praise from the Minister. We need action.
Well, I'm guessing from that the call is probably a teacher involved in education. Look, one of the things we've done, the reason I haven't announced testing for travel until now, is to try to protect the NHS test capacity. We've got more now per head of population than any other country in Europe. We try to protect that for people like school teachers. We've got things like this mass testing, the community testing, lateral flow testing, which means we'll be able to test much more regularly in schools, and look out for announcements on that very soon. I'm not going to pretend there's some easy answer to this. Listeners will be, crazy to imagine there is. We're doing our best. We're trying to do the logical steps. There's no manual for tackling coronavirus, and we have taken the view that it's important to get our kids back into school. I've got kids at school age. I'm pleased that they're back at school rather than that very long period over the spring into the summer where there was no school at all. And we're doing our best. We won't get it all right, but things like being the leading country in Europe and pretty much in the world as a major nation for the capacity of our testing ability is something which directly helps schools, school teachers, and make sure that we can get this turned around quickly.
As a major nation, can people come into London for New Year celebrations, in your view?
I think you should wait till we have the news about the Christmas relief, which will be agreed across the whole of the UK, and then follow that very carefully. I do not know, sitting here today, which tier London will be going into, and it will be wrong for me to provide ad hoc.
If I'm in tier 1, lastly, can I have a carol concert?
Well, you can do a restricted number of things when it comes to singing in tier 1. So, for example, you can go to a place of worship, for example.
Well, I can go to the theatre. And I can hear everybody sing.
That's right.
I must be able to have a carol. When I asked your colleague, Matt Hancock, I don't know whether you heard, his reply was, Inshallah. God willing. And that's all he would say. Grant Shapps, can I have, in tier 1, a carol concert?
I think the answer is going to be that we will have professionals sing, so you can go to a theatre, for example, and hear people sing. But we are well aware of how this virus spreads. It, I'm afraid, spreads through the air and the aerosols and what have you. I think common sense will certainly tell you to keep well apart, whether that's something that you can be sufficiently spaced. I'm afraid this Christmas is not going to be quite like.
So no carol concerts.
I think it's unlikely. I will have to check the specifics on a carol concert and the number of people and the size and whether it's indoors or outdoors and the rest of it before misleading you.
Okay. Well, thank you for slightly more detail than I received from your colleague Grant Shapps, Transport Secretary, appearing here on Call the Cabinet on LBC when news is next.
The Transport Secretary has told LBC he expects the cost of COVID testing for international arrivals to drop quite quickly.